So thank you so much for joining us on what's turned out to be quite a rainy evening here in Scotland, but at least you haven't had to travel anywhere for this. And thank you so much as well for supporting this fundraiser for two brilliant charities. So we will be supporting Sunflower Scotland, who provide support to Ukrainian families here in Scotland and also in Ukraine. And our second charity is the Wings of Hope Foundation, who provide mental health support to young people and other vulnerable groups in Sarajevo. So thank you so much for your help with this. I am absolutely delighted that we have the author Priscilla Morris joining us here this evening. Thank you so much, Priscilla. Priscilla, thank you. Priscilla is the author of the utterly beautiful novel Black Butterflies, which has now been shortlisted for, it might take me a moment to run through these, the Women's Prize for Fiction, the Royal Society of Literature's Ondaatje Prize, and the Authors Club Best First Novel Award. Is there anything I've missed out?
That's it. Perfect.
So far.
A good week.
So just to let you know how the format of this online event, I'll be talking to Priscilla for about half an hour, 40 minutes. And as we go along, if there's any questions that you have, please do type them in the chat box. I'll try to get through to them all at the end. But yes, do type them as you go. A little bit of housekeeping, if you could please keep your microphones on mute and your video switched off. We're in focus mode, so don't worry, you won't be on view to everybody else. So Priscilla, thank you again for joining us and for taking time on a Sunday evening. Really appreciate it.
I'm really pleased to be here. It's great. Thanks, Rebecca.
And it must have been quite a busy week for you.
It's been an incredibly busy, exciting week. The Women's Prize shortlist was announced on Wednesday, which was just obviously completely thrilling. And then the next day, the Ondaatje Prize shortlist. So yeah, it's been a very exciting week.
Yeah. And did I see that you were at a wonderful party on Wednesday as well?
Yes, at Somerset House for the Women's Prize. It was a lot of fun. Yeah.
And how are you feeling after making the shortlist of the Women's Prize?
I'm still on cloud nine. I'm just sort of tingling. I am so thrilled because when Black Butterflies first came out in paperback, I was a bit concerned, as I'm sure all authors are. Is it, how much visibility is it getting? And with the Women's Prize, obviously such a major literary prize, it's really pushed it into the spotlight. So that's just brilliant.
Amazing. Well, very, very well deserved. It's a bit of a joke here in the bookshop that I will stand in the street telling people to read this book because I love it so much.
Brilliant.
so if Duckworth ever wants someone to just wear one of those costumes and stand in the street, I volunteer. So I know that many of the people who are joining us here tonight or who might be watching it on the replay have already read and also loved Black Butterflies. But as we go through, we'll try not to give away too many spoilers about it, because I know that there are one or two people who perhaps haven't had a chance to read it yet, since it is just out in paperback. But for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, would you like to give us just a brief description of it?
Yeah, of course. So it's set in 1992 in Sarajevo in Bosnia in the former Yugoslavia, and it's about an artist and teacher called Zora Kochvich, 55, and it's about how her life is turned upside down by the war that happened with the breakup of Yugoslavia, the Bosnian War, and it basically follows her through the first 10 months of what turned out to be an almost 4-year siege. So it's very much about an experience of life under siege.
Yeah, it's an amazingly powerful book. One of the wonderful points in the novel is the power of stories and storytelling to bring people together. We so rarely get to hear novels read by their author in their own voice. So I wondered if you'd mind reading a short passage from the book for us.
Of course, yeah, I'm delighted. So I thought I'd read a passage from quite early on, which is when Zora's life begins to really turn upside down. And just to set the scene a little, she's having dinner, or lunch rather, with her neighbours. So violence has sort of broken out, but they think war is going to, they don't really understand it to be a war as yet. And they think he'll pass within about a week, 2 weeks. She lives in a tower block on the 8th floor, and her next door neighbour, Mirsad, who's a bookseller, have gone down to the floor below the 7th floor to have a birthday lunch with their neighbours called Vesna, Drago, and their teenage daughter, Lenka. So they have an amazing meal, and it's quite boozy. They have quite a lot to drink. And this is so after the meal, they're all sort of sitting back, chatting. Vesna is asking whether it's better to stay or go. Should they stay in Sarajevo or should they leave? Vesna leans right around the back of her daughter's chair. Cupping her mouth with her hand, she stage whispers to Zora, "We won't leave, of course, because I don't want to lose this apartment. Refugees would take it in a flash. But God, I'm terrified, aren't you? Day by day, Sarajevo is becoming more Muslim." Seeing Zora recoil, Vesna shakes her head. Looking into Zora's eyes with as much steadiness as she can muster, she says, "No, of course, I don't mean like that. We all know Muslims like Mirsad, but..." Mirsad and Lenka are now openly laughing. Zora is about to respond when an enormous boom ripples through the flat and the tabletop slides into her ribs. The jolt her body receives knocks her chair backwards, her head tilting upwards. A great crack opens in the ceiling, and there's an almighty crash as the Art Nouveau lamp, released from its mooring, slams into the middle of the dining table. The back of Zora's head thwacks the floor. Chicken bones, china, cutlery, and glass fall in a clatter about her. Her ears ring as if they've been pummeled. She turns her head slowly, her cheek pressing into the glass scattered on the parquet tiles. A chunk of blue crystal rolls to a halt in front of her eyes. Mirsad has dropped to his knees with his hands above his head in a sort of brace position. Vesna and Drago are somehow under the shattered window, their clothes and hair finely dusted with glass. Vesna is clinging to her husband, crying into his chest. He's sobbing too, a honking, gasping sound. Zora closes her eyes, but everything spins, so she opens them again. Mirsad is the only one moving. He sat up on his haunches and is preparing to get up. "Mum, Dad, look at Mirsad." Lenka's voice floats out from behind the upturned dining table. Mirsad is pulling himself up, brushing bits of glass from his trousers. He says, "I must be going now. It's been, thank you." Zora watches as Mirsad thanks his hosts and then starts making his way in a shaky crab-like sidestep around the knocked-over chairs, his limp, which she normally never notices, more pronounced. In the hallway, he pauses for a moment, his tall frame filling the doorway, then raises his hand in a half salute and leaves. "Mum, Dad," Lenka yells. "Lenka, get down, for God's sake," Drago roars, his face red and blotchy. "Another might come at any second." "But what was it? Another what?" Lenka drops down behind the table again. Zora's gaze shifts to the doorway, wondering why Mirsad left in such a hurry. Then it comes to her. The explosion was so loud, the impact so close, that whatever hit the building must have struck the floor above. She hauls herself to her feet and as quickly as she can follows him out. She takes the stairs, dreading what she might find. The strip light flickers in the corridor that she and Mirsad share. She's about to enter her flat when she sees Mirsad's door has been left ajar. She crosses the hall and pushes. The door swings open and she at once steps back and away. She must have made a mistake. She forces herself back to the threshold and looks. A long, dark hallway strewn with books, fallen paintings, broken china, and glass gives on to another room where Mirsad's living room would be if this were his flat, which it can't be, because at the far end there is open space where wall should be. Zora stares at the opening, which is greyish-white, the colour of nothing, of the void. It exerts a power over her, holding her where she is. The noise of traffic rises from 8 floors below and mingles with the ringing in her ears. Cold air charges down the corridor. She puts a hand to her temple and discovers a warm, coagulating substance that has the texture and viscosity of oil paint. Absently drawing her fingers to her mouth, the taste of blood jolts her back to herself. She wonders if it's an intrusion to go further in. Suddenly she has no idea how well she and Mirsad knows each other. Despite being neighbours for so many years, she's never been into his flat before. She didn't know it was so richly decorated with kilims and deep reds and browns on the walls and the floors. It's like stepping inside a silk purse. And then she remembers that his father ran a Turkish carpet shop where the bookstore is now, and that rugs were his family trade for years before he went into books. And now, the first time she enters his flat, is destroyed, exploded. A flash of dulled silver catches her eye. She bends down and picks up a shard of metal the length of a finger and drops it an instant later as it burns her fingers. She sees other pieces of shrapnel embedded in the walls and starts to tremble. She thought it was only the eastern edges of the city that were being shelled. The realization of how very lucky Mirsad was to be having lunch downstairs comes to her. And then another realization comes. Thank God it wasn't her flat that was hit.
Gosh, that passage, thank you for reading that. It really underlines how quickly and powerfully the siege quite literally explodes into Zora's life, incredibly, and then doesn't leave it, of course. Could I ask what first inspired you to write the book and for how long you were working on it before it was published?
Yes. So my mother is from Sarajevo. My father's English. My mother left long before the war, but her parents, my grandparents, and all her relatives were trapped in Sarajevo during the siege. So I was 19 at the time, very traumatic. We had a lot of refugee relatives passing through our South London home in various states of trauma, jumping each time a door slammed because they were so used to shelling. And it was my great uncle's story that first inspired Black Butterflies. I heard it at my grandfather's funeral in Notting Hill in the Serbian Orthodox Church. So quite a long story, but my father actually went out and rescued my grandparents from the siege. But my grandfather really was very ill and traumatized, and he didn't last that long. He died years later. It was, very sad, obviously. And at the funeral, my mother turned around and said to me, "See that man over there?" And I turned around and I saw this man in a brightly coloured check shirt with a daffodil in his lapel. It's like, yes. And, he was quite elderly. She goes, "Well, he's your great uncle. He was quite a well-known painter in Sarajevo, and he lost his life's work during the siege, and yet he's now started painting again." And I think he was almost 70 at the time, and he was the most amazing man. And it was this, I sat next to him as we went in the sort of procession to the cemetery and talked to him, and it was something to hold on to, the hope he gave on that particular day. And this feeling, my mother said, oh, he's been repainting from memory all these Yugoslav landscapes and Ottoman bridges. He used to love painting these beautiful Ottoman bridges that span many of Bosnia's beautiful rivers. And I just was like, wow, this story just really grabbed me. And it was, for me, in art overcoming the tragedy of war. He went on for another 2 decades painting, living in Bristol,
Amazing.
integrated into life in England, despite being, being dislocated from his life in Sarajevo. And that little story got into my head, and I think I was 20, in my mid-20s when I heard it. I tried to write it in many ways. I tried to write it as first piece of journalism, as a short story, as a children's book at one point, and it never quite surfaced. And it wasn't until I started doing an MA in creative writing at the University of East Anglia, I thought, right, now I'm going to write this as a novel. And in answer to the second part of your question, it's taken me pretty much 13 years to write this.
Wow.
It involved a lot of research, living in Sarajevo, interviewing people, and just it's quite harrowing. Obviously, it's also quite harrowing to write at times, and it's taken quite a lot of time to write this. Yeah.
Wow. That was one of my questions that I had down was although there's moments of great hope in the novel, it is quite harrowing. How did you cope with that mentally, to be researching and writing it for 13 years? And how did you disconnect from it as you were writing?
So I did, I went to Sarajevo for 5 months quite early on to interview people about their experience of the siege, having lived through the siege, and also just to get a real sense of the city, which I knew and loved from childhood. We used to visit my grandparents regularly for amazing summers that when I was little, which really were, had lodged in my memory as very, very happy times, which is why when the war came along, it was just, I really wanted to understand how such a seemingly happy place, with my family being mixed, had imploded into war. So it was, the research there was also just to get a real sense of the place. But when I came back from that to Norwich, I did get depressed for a year, and I found it very difficult to write. So how did I cope with it? I think, so I'd write it. I mean, I was also teaching all the time, so I'd be sort of, writing it in intensive bursts and then teaching in intensive bursts. So that gave me a bit of a change, but each time going back into it took a while to get back into it. It was tricky at times, but then I think part of it was Zora's fantastic character. So I started writing actually with a male protagonist, because as I said, it was based on my uncle, who was an artist. And I found it very difficult. It was too close to his story. I wanted to write it as fiction. And I found maybe that a real turning point came when Zora arrived, and I just changed him to a her, and she became this real sort of fully fleshed character with this resilient, strong woman, younger than my great uncle had been, and quite different. And that was very empowering for me. And when I started writing with her, it gave me a sense of joy as well in the writing, because I really, the parts in the book that deal with her art and stuff were quite joyful for me to write. There's a part where she starts teaching a little girl, Una, how to paint. And, I really started getting very fond of all the characters. And then that starts pulling you along, the characters and the story. And
it's one of the things I love about Zora and about the book is that we're told in the very opening paragraph that she is 55 and at a sort of turning point in her life. And I feel that that's a perspective that we very rarely get in popular culture. We have so many films about motherhood or young love or coming of age tales. Was it a very conscious decision to make her that age?
Well, it was partly, like I said, because my great uncle was 68 and I wanted to make her younger, but it was important to me as well that she had a grown-up daughter in England, which she does do. And so I was like, she couldn't really be that much younger than in her 50s. And it just came to me at 55. And I really liked that because I wanted her child to be grown and gone, and for her to be very much at this stage in her life where she's just wanting to be making art and in her studio. And yet at the very opening passage of the book, you know, she feels she's floundering at the midpoint of her life. Everything else is getting on top of her, errands, cleaning, looking after her elderly husband and mother. And so it was important to me that, and I'm very interested as well in that age. And you're right, there's a lack of focus on it in fiction and films, and I'm not there myself, but I will be fairly soon. And I think 6 years. And yeah, I really enjoyed focusing on her being that age.
It's interesting. Actually, a customer in the shop mentioned that there was an article in the Times that you are the youngest person on the shortlist at they said 49. Sorry to mention your age, but and there was a whole discussion about that in the Times and in the comments section, and about, I think the Times article took the slant of why are there no young writers, and then some of the comments were quite jubilant and saying, well, how can you write if you know this sort of experience at that age? Do you think that you could have written this novel at whatever, 21, whatever? Did you need that experience and maturity to be able to do it justice?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I did try to write it younger in various forms, and it just didn't come. I mean, it was hard, not just because of the harrowing subject matter, which really was very harrowing, but also because it's very close to the bone, of course. It's still, you know, it's in lived memory, and still Sarajevo is still a split, quite unhappy place under the surface, and it felt quite politically sensitive and quite, you know, it doesn't feel like it's a sort of sealed historical fact that you can write about easily. It feels quite fresh. And so all this meant that I think it would have been, unless I was kind of blunderingly insensitive, which I'm not, it would have been quite hard to have taken it on at a younger age. And so I think yeah, it's and you know, I think that reflects in it, of course, the years and also this kind of experience that's fed into it.
Yeah.
Which I would also say of the other novels on the shortlist. And it's very interesting to me. That was very funny when I read that I was the youngest on the shortlist. I really didn't expect that. But I think that's brilliant. Great to have older writers reflected there.
It was strange timing because I just heard about a new prize that's been set up for first-time novelists over the age of 50.
Oh, right.
To try to redress the fact that so many prizes are Young Novelist of the Year or Best Writers Under 30 or whatever. So now is the moment, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the novel, we see just how crucial painting and the act of being creative, creating something, seems to be to Zora for her mental health and well-being. Does that reflect your own experience of writing at all?
So sorry, could you just repeat the question?
So in the book, we see how crucial for Zora's mental health, having the space to be creative, to paint, to create her art, to share it with others is that reflective at all of your own experience, or do you share that with her as a writer?
Yes, definitely. So that is absolutely in the book one of the ways, and that's very much what I was interested in exploring, that art can be one way of, it can be healing, can be a way of processing difficult events. It's how she makes sense of what's going on around her. You know, the sort of newspapers don't tell her anything, and she sort of stops listening or trusting what the politicians are saying. And so for her, it's her way of making sense of the world and processing. And yes, for me as well, very much right, absolutely. I think I wanted to be a writer since the age of 6 when I fell in love with reading, and I wanted to be that voice in someone's head that can give such joy by creating rich worlds and rich characters. I just thought it was the best thing in the world. And then from about the age of 10, I started writing diaries, and very much the diary writing was a form of help dealing with life's difficulties, and really helping myself through that, developing both a sense of self and who I am, and also processing things. I think art in many ways is a real way of, can be very, very healing for people and help them process difficult situations.
Oh, it's certainly amazing in the book, and reminding us that we need it to survive along with everything else, or that it can help us to survive when there is no running water. Or
yes,
yes,
it's interesting because I've got a friend who works for UNESCO, and she read it and she got very, very excited by the book. She goes, oh, this is all the themes that we're very interested in cultural heritage, and in how cultural traditions and storytelling and art can really help people, and how in many ways it's a kind of basic need, and how often in these sort of war-torn situations people think, well, obviously rightly, that the essential needs of the water, food, medicine, which are all stripped away in Sarajevo, but they sort of argue almost just behind that, it just as important is all this culture and sense of art and storytelling and oral traditions that are often lost, that people need them for their identity and self-expression. And this did very much happen in Sarajevo, that cultural buildings were deliberately targeted as part of the sort of campaign of ethnic cleansing to try to eradicate and to ethnically cleanse the people. So one of the key happenings in the novel is the destruction of the library and the old town hall, and that was in many ways an act of what people sometimes call memoricide, trying to destroy all the important documents in that building and the first editions and the building itself.
that was, as a book lover, that was I mean, there are many terrible scenes, but that was particularly awful to read, and of course links into the title of the book so beautifully. Did you always have that as the title in your mind as you went along?
No. So it was originally called The Painter of Bridges, which Zora is called, but I wasn't ever quite happy with it because, I don't know, A, it's a little bit clunky, B, you could imagine it's just someone who goes around painting bridges. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there. And it was a friend and agent, not my agent, but another early reader of it, who just picked out black butterflies. And yeah, it's kind of a perfect title.
The first thing that actually drew me to the book was its beautiful cover, which, and as you go through it, you really learn about the significance of that. Thank you. How much input did you have with that? Was that your choice or part of the team, or?
It was, I had quite a lot of input. So basically my editor, Rowan at Duckworth, a fantastic editor, said to me, would you, were there any images or pictures that you had propped up on your desk while you were writing? Could you send them through? And there were, because I am a very visual person, which is also probably why Zora appealed to me as an artist. And I sent her through about 7 images. One of them was of the Goats Bridge, which photo features here. Another was of the Old Town Hall on fire, in flames, which came to sort of become a symbol of Sarajevo under siege. Another was of my image of Zora, and there were a few others, but I think she sent them on to the designer, and he another was a painting that my great uncle did of Sarajevo, which was very colourful. And so I think he combined basically the colourful palette of his painting and the Old Town Hall on fire. You can sort of see that. Anyway, there's a building, there's obviously explosions, and then right down here, it's a bit difficult to do it in the on that side. This is the little in black there, that's the Goats Bridge, but you probably wouldn't realize that if it was not pointed out. So yeah, I was delighted. And then I got sent various images. One of them was quite different, which actually literally had butterflies on it, and I said, no, that's too on the nose, and I just went for this one. Yeah, I love it. It's a cover, it's great.
I mentioned earlier the allusions to the power of storytelling in the novel, and I'm thinking about the scenes where Mirsad reads his stories or his writings to their neighbours in Zora's flat as they, cluster around the stove. Were they based on real folk tales? And can I ask what inspired you to include them in the novel?
Yes, yes, they are. So this story of the walled up wife, it's a horrific story that Mirsad tells, is fascinatingly one that is found in various forms all over the Balkans and as far afield as India. And it's also included in Ivo Andrić's Bridge over the Drina, a version of it, which is maybe the best, well, maybe it was the best known novel from the former Yugoslavia, and a work of historical fiction, which follows the story of a bridge from its construction to its demolition. And he just mentions this story very briefly, but it's a different version from the one I've included. So it has children instead of the wife. So I just got fascinated with this. Of course, Zora is a painter of bridges, so it ties thematically into the bridge theme that weaves its way through the novel. And I liked the violence against women that's implied in it, but also the artistic endeavor that's going on with creating this bridge and this notion of sacrifice and stuff. I just find it, I mean, I actually don't want to give my personal reading of it because I want that to be open.
Oh, please do. Yes.
I want it to be open to people to read into it, because it's a very sort of open story. And in fact, I've got a whole book about it, The Walled Up Wife, and the many different versions and the many different potential readings of it. What was the second part of your question?
It was asking whether it was based on real folklore and what inspired you to include it in the book.
Yes, so it's important to me that I was exploring art in more than just visual art. So Zora obviously makes art, but Mirsad also writes stories. And so I wanted to have his role as a storyteller made clear there. And he tells the story at this sort of key point in the novel when it's the depth of winter. It's midwinter, and it's completely dark outside. They haven't eaten for many days. The air bridge in that's delivering relief food has been suspended, and they all huddle, all the neighbours huddle in Zora's flat around her stove each evening, and they listen to him telling stories, because of course no electricity, so no TV, no light, so you couldn't really read. And so what do? One of the things you do is tell stories, perform as well. So this was, this, I heard this from people I spoke to, people would play music and you pass the time in these sort of ways. And so he tells this very old Balkan fairy tale to the group of people. It's also got a sort of structural purpose in the novel, because it's a bit of a turning point during which both good and bad things happen. I won't spoil that.
Thank you. Although we have said there are many harrowing moments in it, the one thing that does come across is the importance of community as well, and how people, while some people are profiteering and from the situation, others do seem to draw together. Is that based on your family's own experience of the siege?
Yes, and other people that I spoke to. So when when people spoke to me about the siege, by the way, and I do actually mean people who stayed on in Sarajevo, interestingly, because people who left, like my relatives, most of them left, although most of the families that had Muslim members stayed. That's just the way it was. The ones who left really found it very traumatizing to speak about it, as you might imagine. So my great uncle and great aunt spoke with real clarity about the first moments of the war, and then about their leaving Sarajevo. But they did find it very painful, and it was, I think, probably and I didn't want to push them, of course, and maybe they'd blocked it a little bit in their memory to talk about the actual day-to-day life under siege. Whereas when I went out there and spoke to people who had lived through the siege, and I spoke to many people, including a girl who was 8 at the time, a girl who was a teenager at the time, older people, they told me stories. It was interesting. They wavered between the horror of it and the really awful incidents, and some that were even too awful to put in, because it's almost like there's this resistance almost to believing it when you read it in fiction. And emphasizing what a great time they had. It was like, because you're living day to day and you don't know if you're actually going to make it through the day, because when you go down to the street, a sniper might shoot you or a shell might go off. Of course, when you see a friend, it's like, brilliant, you're still alive. And there's this real feeling of coming together. And when people would all meet together and really pull together in their flats, in my grandparents, they all met together like this in their flat until my dad rescued them. And there would be a sense of helping each other. Everyone would cook together because they'd share one stove. It was a lot about pooling resources and helping each other. People would go and queue for water for each other. And, I heard quite a few times, like, having a glass of water would be like a glass of champagne, because it was so rare. And, just a little bit of food, so you're really appreciating every moment of life.
Yeah. Even just reading the book, I was having a bath this morning and feeling so grateful for the hot water. It really, when you're faced just even in fiction and literature with it, it does make you appreciate everything so much more. One question that popped up in our book clubs for Black Butterflies was some people wondering why Zora didn't move into her mother's flat, which was unoccupied, and was that because of the community that she had in her own home with her neighbours?
Yeah, I think, yes, basically she didn't want to lose her flat, and she had obviously all her belongings. That's where she lived. It was all her belongings were there. And I think she just wanted to stay at home. She didn't want to lose that. She was very anxious about losing either place. And she did become very much connected with the people, with Mirsad, who became a real friend, obviously, and with the neighbours around her.
Another common question that came up in our book clubs we did for Black Butterflies was people desperately wanting to know what happened next and what happens to all the characters. And so, of course, I have to ask, do you think you'll ever return to that world in fiction? No, sorry.
No.
Sorry, everyone.
I do know what happens next, but I'm obviously not going to say, because for me, the novel ends there purposefully, because, oh, well, I don't want to give any spoilers, but it was important to me that there were questions left unanswered, because that kind of reflects, in a way, the disconnection and the dislocation of war, and that, you know, Zora just didn't know. You know, you just don't know what happens to people. My parents, when the phones were cut, you know, they didn't hear from my grandparents for 4 or 5 months, and you know, and there was no, obviously this was in the days just before email and stuff that took off. There was no internet, no easy access to it, and no post. And so this complete, it's quite hard for us to imagine it nowadays, but this complete disconnect was something that I was interested in portraying.
I was thinking about it, reading the book shortly before the war started in Ukraine, and reading it around that time really it's awful, because to see in the book what's happening and then to think what's happening in that conflict, I think I couldn't help but compare the two, and then moments in the book where they do become so disconnected from the outside world. It's a very different experience from what's happening now, where we have so much access to it in so many ways.
Yes, yeah. The resonance is very strong, obviously, and a lot of readers have commented on that, and with other warlike situations. And other people have seen quite a lot of other interesting analogies in it. There's something about a siege-like situation where you are cut off from the rest of the world, and all your supplies, power supplies, food supply is cut off one by one, that lends itself quite well, I think, to, you know, your normal life basically disrupted by forces beyond your control, and the resourcefulness that you have to call on, I think, can resonate on many levels with people. So the war in Ukraine would be one. Other people have said it resonates with my father-in-law, who I just saw today for lunch, was saying to him it felt like the siege of old age. You know, there's a lot of ways in which it can resonate with people.
One question I was wondering when I asked how long you'd been working on it was, in a bizarre way, the lockdown was so much easier than this in so many ways, and yet that sense of isolation or disconnection, or how quickly the world can be upended, it reminded me of it in that way.
Absolutely, that's another way in which it resonates, for sure, with a situation of lockdown. Yeah.
So if you're not returning to the world of Black Butterflies, can I ask, are you working on anything, or are you planning your next novel at all?
Yes, yeah, and I am working on something. It's very much in the early stages. It's going to have, it may be continuing the themes explored actually in The Walled Up Wife, and sort of focusing on similar aged woman, but it won't be set in Yugoslavia, and it will be in contemporary times. I won't say too much more, but it will also have a strong sense of place and character, and be considering the female experience at a key turning point in her life, going from a position of feeling quite invisible and voiceless to a sort of late life blooming in some way.
Very exciting, thank you. I know that, as you mentioned, as well as being a writer, you also are a lecturer at University College Dublin. How do you manage to your time? Would you have any advice for any writers who are writing alongside other roles?
Yeah, it is tricky, but it is all about, I think, basically carving out the time to write, and you do have to just figure out when that is. For me, it's early in the morning. I just find writing first thing in the day is, even if it's just for an hour or 2 hours, is where I'm going to be mentally in the best state, because I'm just sort of woken up. I'm the most creative then. I can give it my all at that stage, and the most sort of alert and awake, and just doing it regularly. So just regularly turning up and putting in the hours. I think for me, why I'm such a big, but each to their own, because I also know a lot of midnight writers and people who actually, carve it in, if they've got children, maybe at between 11 and 12 every day is going to be the best time for you. But I think just actually really looking at your life and thinking, okay, when can I fit in a regular writing routine, and building a writing routine into your life? There's always time to, you might have to get up a bit earlier or go to bed a bit later, but just making the time for it and turning up regularly at your desk.
And just for anybody who joined us a little bit later, if you do have any questions for Priscilla, please do pop them in the chat, in the Zoom chat, and we'll read them out. But until then, I'll keep going with mine because I've got plenty. One question about the crafting of the novel. It's fascinating to discover that originally the main character was male and then became Zora, and the impact that had. Did you always have a clear idea of the key plot points, or did anything surprise you as you went along?
I did have quite a clear idea of them, because I was, that the fire was one of the main events that I knew would happen. And I've basically sort of woven together parts of my great uncle's story and parts of my grandparents' story. I think I also really wanted it to follow as accurately as I could the actual stages of the siege. So I was very interested in, making it historically accurate in chronological terms. So that gave it a structure as well, the actual events of the siege, and as they happened, where I think the electricity went in June and the water went in July, and just knowing all these things, and so that kind of gave it a structure. What surprised me was, as soon as I wrote the fire scene, which is kind of maybe a midpoint of the novel, I think because I've been building up to it for so long, I felt an incredible rush of creative energy after that. It was kind of interesting. And also, this is where Zora's story started to really diverge from my great uncle's. And so then, yes, things started happening that I hadn't planned. And it was actually a really joyous moment of just writing. So the section that's called Autumn, because it's divided into, rather than chapters, it's divided into 5 sections, the 4 seasons and then New Year. The third section, Autumn, really flowed very quickly. and was quite a joy to write, actually, and a lot of in there. And then winter as well also diverged from what I'd expected and planned.
And we've got a question from Natalie saying, hello, Priscilla. I'd love to hear more about your creative process when translating your research into characters and scenes. So yes, how do you get from the research into those characters and those scenes?
Hi, Natalie. Good question. So, like I said, when I'd done my research, it is very tricky, actually, you're right. So I came back and I was depressed for a year, more or less, and I found it both the traumatic nature of the research, but also just, in my experience, you can, once you've read something, there can be a desire to pack it all in because you know it and because it's interesting. And of course, that actually, you're not writing a history book, you don't want it to be too dry, you don't want to start lecturing people. And so I kind of waited for a time to let it recede into me, sink in. And I made sure I was always leading with Zora's character, her emotions, her story. And after a while, I found that when I'd absorbed it enough, it became a bit like second nature. So, but it did take quite a lot of drafts and drafting out until that happened. And, so it's also something I tell my creative writing students, that there has to be a period, I think, of digestion of all the research you've done, and that always try to lead with the character and the emotional story rather than too much shoehorning in of research, so you're sort of hitting the reader over the head with it.
Thank you. We have another message. So this question is, so so slight spoiler. So we have one question, which is, I'm going to read it slightly differently. Did you know that Zora and Mersad's relationship would develop as it did? I veered between absolutely understanding Zora's choices and need for human connection and feeling a bit let down by her. So yes, was that a surprise, or did you always know where that would go?
Oh, hi. I just know you're called iPad 4. But yes, I actually did always know that it would develop in that way. And yeah, I'm sorry you felt a little bit let down by her. That's interesting. People have had all sorts of responses to that. It's been quite interesting. Again, based on real life stories, interviews. There were a lot of, I'm just going to spoil it a bit. There were
if you don't want to go.
There were a lot of wartime affairs that went on. You do not know if, at the point that it happened, Zora doesn't think she's ever going to see her family again. She thinks that's it. You don't know if you're going to survive, and you do desperately need connection. And Zora genuinely, they become very, very deep, good friends. So for me, it always teetered on this sort of edge between just deep friendship and love. And so the foggy, uncertain way it ended, yeah. So I did want to leave it like that. So it's even a little bit unclear, because she remembers slightly different things about their leaving words. And I think that's partly to obviously reflect her state of shock. And that your memory does go. I mean, it really does go in times like this, of course. And, it was a very difficult, traumatic thing for her, but I think that is obviously what she would have done in that situation. Good question.
It's a very good question. And we had a lot of different responses in the reading in the book clubs. But for me, it really shows the complexity of human life when faced with these extraordinary situations and human emotion.
Yeah.
As a bookseller, of course, I loved how Mirsad's bookshop became such a hub in the book. Was that very intentional for you to do that?
I loved, that was the other thing I really loved writing about Mirsad's bookshop. And yes, and that was also something that was departed from the stories I knew, although it was based on a shop that I did visit, not a bookshop, but a very interesting shop that are framers actually, who made frames for art. That, you know, there's this real culture in Sarajevo of gathering around and having coffees, little strong Turkish coffees, and just passing the time away in these shops. It's all quite slow time in Sarajevo, a lot of coffee drinking, chatting. And I wanted to sort of represent that went on there. And then also I was very interested in, you know, Mirsad's a very good man, and how he gets involved in the relief aid effort and how it had multi-functions, the shop. So it becomes a food distribution point, and then he also starts loaning out books at one point for people to read. Yeah, I enjoyed writing those scenes.
I have to ask, do you have a favorite bookshop, or is that too difficult to answer?
Haven't been to yours yet. I love all bookshops, and I've lived in so many different places. You know, it's always, for me, the local bookshop is a bit of a source of sanctuary to go to and to know. I just love it, in that you're shopping in the high street and it's all filled with consumerism, and there's something much more calming about going into a bookshop, sort of like the equivalent for me of going into an art gallery, or you know, just something very, very calming and focusing about going into a bookshop. I live part of the year in Ireland and part of the year in Catalonia, and there's a beautiful bookshop in the town of Colonge near me, which probably is my current favourite. The town is beautiful. It's got 7 medieval town. It's got 7 independent bookshops there, and there's one in particular that kind of has a little bit of everything in it. It's actually got, interestingly, it's got a bar in it, and it's got a little garden at the back. Always is, you know, lots of sun, and they put on little music events and readings, and it just has the most beautiful display of books in Catalan, Spanish, and English.
Okay, I'm going to be immediately Googling that after this.
I'll get you the name.
Thank you. I'll share it with everybody when I send out the recording. We'll have to go on a pilgrimage. We're almost coming to the end of our time. If there are any last minute questions, please do type them in quickly. But otherwise, thank you so much, Priscilla, for your time. And yes, what must have been a really, really busy week, and a very exciting week. And crossing fingers, toes, and everything else for the Women's Prize and all of the awards that you're shortlisted for. It's a beautiful book, and it really does deserve all the acclaim.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you to everyone for coming, taking a bit of time out on your bank holiday weekend Sunday. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, and best of luck with book 2.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much for joining us, everybody. I will be sending out a recording tomorrow. Oh, and Louise, oh, wonderful. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Natalie.
Okay, good. Take care and have a good evening. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Oh, one more message. I better see. It is a wonderful book. Yes. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.